Have you ever been looked at like you didn't belong in a place you've worked your whole life to reach? Have you ever felt the sting of being judged, not for what you've done, but for what you look like? Now, imagine this. You've spent decades building your name a respected CEO, a woman of quiet strength and endless grace. You walk onto a plane, ready to rest before another long day of leadership. But before you even sit down, someone looks at you and says, "Are you sure that you're in the right seat?" In that moment, time freezes. The other passengers stare. The flight attendant shifts uncomfortably. You have two choices: to stay silent and let it pass like every other injustice that hides behind a polite smile, or to stand up, not with anger, but with one question powerful enough to make an entire airline stop and look in the mirror. What would you do? Would you stay quiet, or would you ask the question that could change everything? This is the true story of Dr. Naomi Ellison, a black woman who turned humiliation into hope and forced the world to see what respect really means. It began with one denied seat and ended with an entire industry grounded by her courage. Because sometimes, one calm voice can shake the sky. If her story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Stay with us as we uncover how one question changed the way the world learns to fly. The night at Newark Liberty was quieter than usual. The long rows of neon lights reflected off the polished stone floor, stretching out like silent streaks of light in time. In the first-class waiting area, a woman sat pensively by the window, watching the planes lined up on the runway like giant steel birds preparing to leave their nests. It was Dr. Naomi Ellison, 42 years old, CEO of NeuroBridge Health Systems, a well-known medical technology company in Boston. She had just finished speaking at the International Conference on Humanistic Leadership in Modern Medicine. She was small, her hair was cropped short, her eyes were deep and calm, the kind of calm that comes from someone who has weathered storms. Naomi checked her e-ticket on her phone, Aerovista Airlines, first class, Gate 17A, destination Cape Town, South Africa. The flight was 13 hours long. She was there to sign a sponsorship deal for a public health program. The loudspeaker announced softly, "Flight AV312 to Cape Town will begin boarding in 15 minutes. First-class passengers and elite platinum members, please prepare yourselves." Naomi closed her laptop and took a sip of her warm coffee. Her phone screen flashed a text message from her mother. "Daughter, keep kindness. It is needed everywhere." She smiled slightly. "Yes, Mama, always." Her hand gently held the ticket as if it were a reminder every road has its price. As she stood, a few glances passed her way. A black woman in a smart suit in first class seemed to be a sight to behold. Naomi was used to it. Not curiosity, but the kind of half-doubtful, half-judging stare she'd encountered hundreds of times in her CEO career. She walked slowly, dragging her suitcase to door 17A on the electronic board. White letters flashed boarding first class. Evelyn Marsh, the flight attendant, was greeting the passengers. Her smile was professional, her voice polite, her every word rehearsed. But when Naomi handed over the tickets, Evelyn paused for half a second. She looked Naomi up and down. Then she looked up, her voice a little slow. "Excuse me, ma'am, this is the first-class section." "Are you sure this is the correct ticket?" Naomi raised her eyebrows, her voice calm. "I think so. My ticket clearly says row 2A. She took out her phone. the screen clearly showing the words First Class, Boarding Zone A. Evelyn glanced over, but her eyes still showed hesitation. I just need to double-check, because first-class tickets are usually for elite platinum members. The sentence was like a small needle piercing through the calm shell. Naomi looked straight at her. She didn't need to raise her voice, just enough to let the other person feel that she was being examined. "You think I'm not one of them." Evelyn smiled awkwardly, avoided eye contact, then turned to the desk and called softly into the walkie-talkie. The atmosphere around them became tense. A few passengers behind them began to whisper. A silver-haired man exclaimed, "Is that still happening in this day and age?" Naomi didn't answer. She stood still, her hand resting lightly on the strap of her suitcase. In her head, her mother's voice echoed again, "Be kind, my dear." But her heart ached, not from suspicion, but from the familiarity of this moment. She was the only woman and the only black person in the first Silicon Valley investor meeting room. When she presented her plan for a medical technology that would save thousands of lives, one of the investors said, "Your idea is great, but we need a more relatable face." Naomi still clearly remembers that look in her eyes, the same look as Evelyn's now. An airline manager stepped forward. He wore a dark uniform and a shiny name tag, Richard Lyle, Passenger Operations. His voice was soft but cold. "Ma'am, there seems to be a slight error in the system. We don't see your elite profile on the first-class passenger list." Naomi took a deep breath. "I don't remember that dignity required membership." The air was still. Evelyn looked down. A few passengers stopped. Mark Hamilton, the lawyer behind her, absent-mindedly took out his phone and filmed a short clip. Naomi did not shout or complain. She only added, her voice as low as the night wind, "If you need to check, I'll wait. But please remember, respect doesn't depend on the system." Richard looked at Naomi, slightly confused. She stood straight, her eyes showing no fear. After a while, he said, "Sorry for the inconvenience. You may board the plane." Naomi nodded slightly. She stepped through the boarding doors, the yellow light from the walkway reflecting off her face, half tired, half calm. Little did she know that in a few hours, the very door that had just closed behind her would open to the world something much bigger than a seat on an airplane. The door to first class opened, a soft yellow light spilling out like a warm streak. Dr. Naomi Ellison walked through, her hand still clutching the e-ticket. No one said anything more, just the sound of suitcase wheels rolling smoothly on the carpet. She sat down in the seat 2A, took a deep breath. The leather was soft, the scent of lavender wafted through the air, but the silence made her hear her own heartbeat more clearly. It wasn't fear, but the familiar heaviness she felt whenever someone challenged her simply because she was black. Evelyn Marsh walked past, her steps a little hesitant. Naomi looked out the window, where the lights were shimmering like a river of light. The flight attendant's voice came from behind her. "Miss, I may need to confirm the information from the headquarters. It's just a formality." Naomi turned back, smiling faintly. "You just do your work. I'll be here. I bought this chair. I didn't borrow it from anyone." Another passenger, a gray-haired man, glanced over and pretended to read his newspaper. A young white woman sitting across from him smiled wryly. The entire first-class cabin seemed to be stretched taut by an invisible string. She could feel the eyes scrutinizing her every move. Naomi closed her eyes. Memories flooded her mind. She remembered a meeting 10 years ago, a room full of white men, when she had talked about neural connections that could help paralyzed people move again. One of them had asked, "What evidence do you have that your people can manage a project of this magnitude?" Her people, the words had stung like a knife, but today she would not let that stab again. The intercom crackled. Evelyn answered in a low voice, but Naomi caught a few words, "Passenger, not on the membership list." She didn't want to hear any more. She just said quietly, her voice calm Evelyn, "I built a company from scratch. I've been in places people didn't think I should be. So you do what you think is right, but I'll do what's right for me." Evelyn was silent. Naomi looked at the young girl. There was no resentment in her eyes, only an unspoken question. Why do people fear respect from others? The plane began boarding. A cold breeze blew from the hallway, carrying the smell of coffee and the distant sound of speakers. Mark Hamilton, the man waiting in line, glanced at Naomi. He didn't know why he took out his phone to film, but there was something about the woman's composure that made him unable to look away. Evelyn took a call from Richard Lyle below the boarding gate. His voice came through the headset. "Let her sit, but make a note of it. I'll report back," Evelyn replied. "Yes, I understand." She turned back, forcing a smile. "It's okay. Ms. Ellison." Naomi looked straight at him and spoke slowly. "It's okay not because you're allowed to, but because I know I'm worthy." Evelyn nodded and walked toward the maid's room. Naomi sat still, her eyes fixed on the window. A white child passed by and waved at her. Naomi smiled back. There was no color in the child's eyes, only innocent curiosity. As the engine started, she opened her notebook and wrote a few words. The habit helped her stay balanced when emotions ran high. Every journey begins with a test, and sometimes it's not the ticket you're checking, it's your self-respect. Evelyn returned with a glass of lemonade. "Would you like some wine?" Naomi shook her head. "No, thanks. I need a clear head, not a numb one." Evelyn pursed her lips, set the glass down on the table, and left quietly. Outside, a light rain had begun to fall. The drops on the window reflected thousands of tiny lights. Naomi touched the cold glass with her hand, thinking of the hundreds of employees waiting for her to sign her contract in Cape Town. She knew what she had done today would probably make news, but what bothered her more was the silence of the people sitting around her. No one said a word. No one objected. That silence was sometimes worse than prejudice. Mark sat down in row 3B, right behind her. He opened his phone and watched the short clip he had just recorded, the image of Naomi standing silently in the hallway, her deep voice asking, "Do you think I don't belong here?" He felt his chest tighten. He didn't know why, but the question made him ashamed. He thought of his sister, who had been rejected from a job because of her naturally curly hair. The plane began to taxi. The engine noise grew louder. Naomi closed her eyes and breathed evenly. "Don't let anger control you," she told herself. "Let the truth control you." A flight attendant came over to check the seat belt. She whispered to Evelyn. "Who is she?" Evelyn replied softly. "A first-class passenger. Someone important, it seems." Naomi heard and smiled slightly. She was not important. She simply refused to be looked down upon. As the plane took off, the cabin lights dimmed. Naomi looked out at the night sky, the thick clouds drifting by like memories. She remembered her mother's words, the nights they sat together in the small house in Georgia, when her mother would say, You may not get the front seat, but sit like someone who knows you deserve it." She chuckled. "Mama, I think I understand that better today than ever." The seatbelt sign went off. Evelyn appeared again. Her voice really soft this time, Miss Ellison. "I want to apologize if I did anything to offend you." Naomi looked up, her eyes softening. "I don't need you to apologize for the system. I just hope that next time you see someone who doesn't look like you won't be so quick to think they're out of place." Evelyn nodded, her eyes red. She left without another word. Naomi leaned her head back in her seat. In her mind, she sensed something changing, not just in this first-class cabin, but somewhere deeper in the consciousness of those who had just witnessed it. Mark turned his phone on airplane mode, the screen light flickering off. He opened the notes section and wrote, "A woman taught us tonight that class isn't on a ticket. It's in the way we treat others." Outside, the plane hurtled south. Thunder flashed in the sky, then faded. Naomi closed her eyes. Little did she know that in a few hours, Mark's clip would become a fire that would make the entire system look at itself. The flight was nearly an hour in, and everything was quiet. Passengers were reading, watching movies, or closing their eyes. Naomi sat up straight, her flashlight shining on the notebook she was writing in. She wrote a few short notes, her handwriting soft but firm. Respect doesn't need an apology. It needs to be practiced. She closed the notebook and reached to adjust the blanket, but then the familiar footsteps rang out. Evelyn Marsh appeared again. She held a tablet in her hand, looking slightly embarrassed. "Miss Ellison, I'm really sorry, but we just received a response from headquarters. They need me to verify your ticket again." Evelyn's voice trembled slightly. Naomi looked up, her eyes calm but deep as water. "You say verify, we're already in the air. What are you going to do? Bring me down?" Evelyn was confused, her lips moving, but she couldn't form any words. A few passengers turned. The air in the cabin cooled a little. Naomi looked around, then leaned forward slightly, her voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Evelyn, can I ask you something?" The flight attendant paused and nodded. Naomi spoke slowly, each word falling on each breath. "What do you think a first-class passenger looks like?" The question silenced the entire cabin. Evelyn stood still, her face stiff. Naomi continued to look at her, not angry, just as if waiting for an honest answer. I didn't mean anything." Evelyn faltered. Naomi tilted her head, her voice still soft. "I'm not asking about intentions. I'm asking about the image in your mind. What kind of person?" No one spoke. Mark Hamilton sat in the back row, looking up, his throat dry. The question sounded simple, but it penetrated the deepest part of his consciousness. Evelyn bowed her head. Naomi didn't say anything more. She opened the thin blanket and poured herself some water. "You know, I used to ask myself that. When I was a kid, I used to look over the airport fence and see people in suits and leather suitcases. I used to think first class was for rich people, but then I realized it's not money that gets you there, it's how the world defines value." Evelyn stood there, her hands clasped together. Naomi looked at her, her voice low, almost a whisper. "But what if the world gets it wrong? What if a person's true worth lies elsewhere?" "Evelyn," no one in the cabin dared to breathe. A few passengers looked at each other. Some turned to face the window. Naomi closed her eyes. leaning her head back against the seat. She didn't need an apology. She just wanted the people around her to wonder what they hadn't asked. At that moment, Mark took out his phone. He didn't turn it around anymore, just opened the notes section and wrote a few lines. A question can be more powerful than an accusation. Evelyn turned away. As she walked towards the service cabin, Naomi said softly, without looking back, "I'm not angry with you. Evelyn, I just regret that you let the system teach you how to read people." Evelyn paused, then walked quickly away. Naomi watched, not feeling pleased. She sighed, wondering if the young woman had noticed. She remembered her 20s, standing at the front desk, wearing a uniform and smiling at people who would never look her in the eye. The announcement came. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're expecting some light turbulence ahead." Naomi pulled the covers up and closed her eyes. Outside, the clouds were like white walls, thick and still. In the slight vibration of the plane, she found herself drifting between two worlds. One was the past, the other was the present. And in between was the question she had just asked. She knew it would not resonate only in this cabin. About an hour later, when the flight had settled, Mark stood up and went to the bathroom. On the way, he caught Evelyn's eye. She looked tired, her face full of conflict. He whispered, "I saw everything. I think you should thank her. Not everyone has the patience to teach us like that." Evelyn didn't reply, just bowed her head. When he returned to his chair, Naomi opened her eyes. "You were the one filming, weren't you?" she asked, her voice non-accusatory. Mark hesitated. "Yes, but I just wanted to record it, so no one would say it was my imagination." Naomi smiled, a gentle, somewhat tired smile. "Thank you. Sometimes evidence is the only thing people will believe." Mark nodded. "I apologize for not doing anything," Naomi replied. "Sometimes just watching is enough. People don't change the world by shouting. They change by staring at what's wrong." They were silent for a long time. The engine hummed steadily. Naomi opened the curtains, and outside the sky was pitch black, with a faint streak of moonlight in the distance. "You know," she said, "I don't want to be a victim in my story. I just want to ask the question everyone is afraid to ask. Why does respect have to be proven?" Mark was silent, unable to answer. He knew this was no longer a question just for her. The first-class cabin was strangely quiet. A few passengers tried to pretend to sleep, but everyone heard. Naomi leaned back, her eyes staring into the distance. In her mind, she saw her first office, the sleepless nights writing financial plans, the sarcasm when she walked into the conference room. She had asked herself 1,000 times, "When will I be seen as a person?" Not an exception beside him. Mark's reading lamp was still on. He quickly typed a few more lines on his phone. If respect must be proven, then what is the price of justice? He lingered, feeling as if something in his chest was changing. The footsteps sounded again. Evelyn returned, carrying the slip of paper. "Miss Ellison," she said, her voice much softer. "I've confirmed it. Your ticket is perfectly valid. I apologize for doubting you." Naomi looked at the young girl with gentle eyes. "Thank you. I don't need an apology for myself. I just hope that the next time you see someone like me, you won't need to verify." Evelyn nodded, her eyes moist. Naomi placed her hand on the paper. Her voice slowing. "Everyone is learning. Evelyn, me too. It's just that today's lesson was a bit expensive." Evelyn walked away. her head slightly bowed. Naomi sighed, then smiled slightly. She knew that in this world, no one was truly innocent, but perhaps, if just one person dared to ask, things would begin to change. The plane continued to glide through the clouds, leaving a long streak of light in the sky. Naomi looked down at her notebook and wrote another line. Sometimes, questions don't need to be answered. They just need to be heard. The air in the first class was still quiet, but the silence was no longer normal. There was something in the air, a feeling both heavy and awake. Naomi sat still, her eyes fixed on the window. The sky below was a sea of thick clouds. The moon cast a silvery glow over it. She felt as if she were floating between two worlds, the world of those who believed things could change, and the world of those who thought things would stay the same. She didn't know how long she had been sitting until she heard familiar footsteps approaching. Evelyn Marsh reappeared, holding a tray of drinks. She placed a glass of water on Naomi's table and said softly, "I brought you some more. No alcohol, just water." Naomi looked at her and replied softly, "Thank you. I need that more than anything else." Evelyn stood still, not leaving immediately. It seemed like she wanted to say something but was afraid that her own words would make things worse. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her voice soft as the wind. "Is there anything else you want to say?" "Evelyn." The flight attendant nodded slightly, then took a deep breath. "I just want to explain a little. I don't mean to upset you. We are trained to check everything carefully, especially when something doesn't match in the system." Naomi looked at her, her eyes no longer cold. "You don't need to explain to me. I know you're just doing your job, but sometimes the way we do that job makes others question the very system that taught us." Evelyn pursed her lips, her eyes glistening. "I don't think I'm biased. I just follow the process." Naomi nodded slightly. "I believe you, but I also believe that sometimes processes are built on fear, not respect." Evelyn was silent. Naomi looked at the young woman, suddenly feeling more pity than anger. She knew the feeling of having to obey, of doing things right, of shrinking herself to fit into someone else's mold. She had been there, years ago, as a fresh graduate. She had been the barista, the filer, the one who was constantly asked, "Are you sure you belong here?" Naomi continued, her voice low but clear. "Evelyn, have you ever wondered what it would take for someone to apologize for being treated fairly?" Evelyn sighed, shaking her head slightly. "I never thought about it." Naomi smiled, not a sarcastic smile, but a slightly sad smile. "I think about it every day." She picked up the glass of water, watching the water ripple in the dim light. "When I was a child, my mother was a nurse. She told me about a time when a patient refused to let her give her an injection because they thought a black person wasn't clean enough. When I asked her if she was angry, she said, 'I am angry, but I'm angry because they haven't learned the lesson I already know, that a person is not measured by the color of their skin, but by the content of their heart.' I learned that anger doesn't help you fly higher. It only keeps you grounded." Evelyn swallowed, her voice trembling. "I'm really sorry." Naomi smiled. "Thank you, but don't apologize to me. Ask yourself why the first moment you saw me, you felt the need to check." The words left Evelyn frozen, unable to respond. There was a genuine confusion in her eyes, a departure from the professional role of a head stewardess. Naomi saw it clearly, and she suddenly felt a small change happening. Perhaps that was why she didn't get angry. The plane shook slightly, the cabin shook for a moment, then steadied. Naomi looked out. The sky streaked with lightning. Evelyn said softly, "I used to dream of being a flight attendant and traveling everywhere. But the more I traveled, the more I realized I didn't really touch anyone. I just passed them by." Naomi looked at her and whispered, "Maybe today you've started to touch me." Evelyn chuckled softly, then turned away. Naomi sat still, her head leaning back in her chair. There was a strange warmth in her heart. Even though it wasn't over, she could feel something moving, very small, but real. Mark Hamilton watched from the back seat. He saw the conversation, heard the fragments of words that fell through the air. He saw Evelyn wipe away tears as she walked toward the service room. He turned to look at Naomi. She said nothing, just looked out the window, her shoulders shaken slightly, but not from weakness. It was the look of someone holding herself together so as not to break down. Mark heard the voice of an old teacher in his head. Justice doesn't always come from a courtroom. Sometimes it comes from asking the right question. He understood that what he had just witnessed was not an argument, but a moment of awakening. Naomi felt that gaze. She turned to look at Mark and whispered, "You see, just one question can change the atmosphere." Mark nodded. "That's right. But not everyone is brave enough to ask." Naomi smiled, her eyes still looking far away, because they're afraid of the answer. The loudspeaker announced that dinner was about to be served. Naomi turned on her phone and put it on silent. She read some old messages from the staff before the flight. "Have a safe flight. We are proud of you." Her nose stung. Although she had won many awards and been invited to speak at Harvard, she had probably never felt like she was truly representing someone like she did now. She said softly to herself, low enough for only herself to hear, "I don't fly just for myself." Evelyn turned back, this time with a different look in her eyes. "Thank you, Ms. Ellison," she said softly. "I think I learned a lesson today that no school can teach." Naomi nodded. "Good. Because when people learn, the world becomes less cold." The cabin returned to soft light. Naomi closed her eyes, listening to the steady hum of the engines. In the silence, she felt her heart slowly calm down. It was no longer as heavy as before. She knew that the greatest battle of her life was not to prove herself, but to maintain her dignity in the places where it was easiest to lose. Outside, the sky opened up, the moon brighter. Naomi spoke softly, as if sending it into the air. "If I had to ask that question 1,000 times, I would still ask it, because sometimes the right question is a prayer." Early the next morning, the first rays of sunlight streamed through the glass windows of Cape Town Airport. Naomi Ellison dragged her small suitcase and walked slowly out of immigration. She was tired, but kept her posture straight and calm as always. No one could have guessed that a few hours earlier. A brief question she asked on the plane had spread all over the internet. Naomi had no idea about it. Her phone was still on silent mode. Across the ocean in New York, lawyer Mark Hamilton woke up early. He sat in his small Manhattan apartment, looking at his phone. The video he recorded last night was posted online with the caption, "When a woman asks the right question, the world listens," in the clip. Naomi stood still in the middle of the first-class cabin. Her voice clearly heard, "What do you think a first-class passenger looks like?" The question rang out. Short, but it left viewers speechless. In just the first 10 minutes, the video had tens of thousands of views. After an hour, that number exceeded 3 million. On social media, the comments started to appear. She speaks for so many people. I'm white, but it still makes me choke up. This isn't just about seats. This is about dignity. The hashtag #YanSeat of respect started to spread across platforms. Naomi left the airport and got into her car. She watched the scenery pass by, the low-slung houses, the street vendors, the strangely blue sky. She hadn't turned on her phone yet. Her mind was still on her conversation with Evelyn Marsh. It seemed like it had ended so easily. She had no idea that on the other side of the world, millions of people were calling her name. At Aerovista Airlines headquarters in Dallas, Communications Director Eleanor Briggs sat in a conference room, her face tense. On the big screen was a video that was going viral. A reporter in the clip commented a black passenger was asked to verify her first-class ticket. Her reaction stopped the world. Eleanor clicked off the screen and said quietly, "We need to respond before this becomes a global crisis." But who is she asked? A young employee. Naomi Ellison. Eleanor replied, CEO of NeuroBridge Health Systems. She was named one of Forbes's 100 humanitarian leaders. The room fell silent. "We've got the wrong person," whispered another. At the same time, Naomi entered the hotel. As soon as she sat down, her phone started buzzing. A series of notifications flooded the screen. Messages from friends, partners, employees, reporters. Her name appeared on the front page of dozens of newspapers. Naomi opened a message from Mark. "The video is going viral. I don't know if you want this, but the world is listening." She opened the video. The screen showed her face in the dim light of first class. Her calm voice rang out. "What do you think a first-class passenger looks like?" Below were thousands of comments, many telling stories of how they had been treated unfairly. Naomi put the phone down on the table. Clasping her hands together, she sighed. Her first feeling was not pride, but heaviness. She had no intention of becoming a symbol. She just wanted to live as a normal, respected human being. But now, the story had spiraled out of control. She looked out the window at the rising sun. Her heart filled with conflict. At an afternoon press conference in New York, reporters crowded in. "Does Aerovista Airlines have any comment on the viral video?" Eleanor Briggs stepped up to the podium, smiling wryly. "We are investigating. It could be a misunderstanding." The statement was met with immediate online criticism. One comment stood out: "Misunderstandings don't work when the system is built to be suspicious of people who aren't like you." At her hotel in Cape Town, Naomi sat in her room. She opened her laptop and saw her inbox was flooded with messages. Some were thanking her, others were telling their stories. One woman wrote Naomi, "I was asked to have my bag checked at the airport today because I am black. I didn't dare say anything, but when I saw you, I cried." Naomi put her hands to the keyboard, unsure how to respond. She didn't want to be a symbol of struggle. She was just a woman tired from a long flight. But she understood that when someone asked the right question, it wasn't theirs anymore. That evening, Mark called her. His voice was a little grainy, but sincere. "Are you okay?" Naomi replied. "Fine. Just a little dizzy. I didn't expect things to go this far," Mark said. "You know, I've watched the video a dozen times. Every time I hear that question, it hurts." Naomi chuckled, maybe because deep down, everyone has been asked the same question, except society is asking it. Mark was silent for a moment, then said, "You don't need to do anything else. Your question did its job," Naomi replied. I don't know. I don't want people to just be angry. I want them to think. After the call, Naomi sat alone in the dimly lit room. The sound of the ocean waves drifted in from afar. She remembered Evelyn's eyes, the young girl's tears, maybe somewhere. Evelyn was reading the news, feeling ashamed or grateful or both. On TV, international news showed Naomi stepping off a plane. The headlines below read Naomi Ellison, the woman who made the world question stereotypes. She turned off the TV, wondering if this was what her mother had wanted. "Don't try to prove you're worthy," her mother had said. "Live so that no one can deny it." Naomi opened her notebook and wrote, "I don't want to teach anyone a lesson. I just want the world to remember that respect is not a privilege." In Dallas, Eleanor Briggs was under tremendous pressure. Emergency meetings lasted all night. Shareholders demanded explanations. The Federal Aviation Administration ordered a review of first-class service. Some AeroVista flights were delayed for review. People called it the Naomi Ellison effect. Naomi sat staring out the hotel window at the night sky. The moonlight reflected off the ocean, rippling like sighs. She felt clearly that what she had raised was not just a question, but a crack in the wall of silence that society had built for so long. She closed her eyes and said softly to herself, "If just one question can make people think, then perhaps I will continue asking." The news spread faster than the planes that AeroVista was operating. Within 24 hours, Naomi Ellison's video became a global sensation. Major television channels such as CNN, BBC, Fox News all replayed the clip, each with a different perspective. Some called her a symbol of dignity. Others said that her question made the world look at itself. The keyword first-class question topped the search results for 3 days. In Boston, the offices of Neurobridge Health Systems glowed in the night. Employees gathered around a large screen to watch an NBC special interview. A question asked on a flight sparked a conversation about class and race discrimination in the airline industry. The host said with an amused smile. A young employee turned to a colleague, her eyes brimming with tears. "That's my boss. She's doing what many people can only dream of." Naomi was different. She sat in her hotel room in Cape Town, the windows wide open. The sound of traffic outside mingled with the morning birds. In front of her was a laptop, hundreds of emails popping up. She read the first few lines, then stopped at a letter from a stranger. A man wrote, "I am a former pilot. I've seen many passengers treated unfairly, but never dared to speak up. Thank you for asking the question that should have been asked for us." Naomi leaned back in her chair, her eyes looking into the distance. She didn't expect a single question to create such a stir. What started as a short video became a movement. New hashtags emerged. Seat of respect, fly equal, ask the question. Similar stories were shared everywhere at restaurants, banks, schools. People began recounting how they had been judged based on their appearance or their background. Each story was a small piece of the truth that everyone had once ignored. At AeroVista headquarters in Dallas, Eleanor Briggs barely slept. The company's inbox was flooded with notifications. The company's stock was plummeting. Reporters were stationed outside the gates, and politicians were starting to speak out. Some supported Naomi, seeing her as a symbol of change. Others criticized her for stirring up public emotions. Eleanor sat in a conference room, an urgent report in front of her. "If we don't get this under control, the FAA will step in," an advisor said. "We need to apologize publicly." Eleanor fell silent, staring at the screen where Naomi's face appeared on the news, knowing any apology was too late. That evening, Naomi was invited to do a live interview from Cape Town. The host asked her in a low voice, "Ms. Ellison, did you anticipate the impact of that question?" Naomi chuckled. "No, I just asked what everyone should have asked. When you're doubted for being yourself, the question just pops out, unprepared." She paused, then added, "I don't want to be a symbol. I just want people to understand that respect is not a reward. It's a starting point." Naomi's response was widely quoted. One major newspaper wrote, "In the noisy world of excuses, some choose to be silent, and some choose to ask questions." In Georgia, a group of college students held a discussion called "The Question That Grounded the Fleet." They talked about Naomi, about questions, and about the change that comes from awareness. Mark Hamilton watched everything on his laptop. He still couldn't believe that a video shot on a plane could do what hundreds of speeches couldn't. "You filmed the moment that changed the world." His friends texted him. He just smiled. "No, she did. I just kept the evidence." That night in Cape Town, Naomi couldn't sleep. She stepped out onto the balcony, the sea breeze carrying a salty scent. There was a strange feeling in her heart. Not joy, not quite fear. Like when you throw a stone into the water. The ripples spread farther than you thought, and you can't stop them. She thought about the comments, about the thanks, about the criticism. Some said she was using the story to gain fame. Some said she was too dramatic. But she knew that each person would hear that question in their own way. The next morning, the media flocked to the hotel where she was staying. Reporters were waiting in the lobby, cameras trained on the elevator doors. Naomi didn't want to answer any more questions. She only said a short sentence. "Thank you, everyone. I believe there are stories that don't need to be told, because they've told themselves enough." Meanwhile, in Dallas, Aero Vista executives received an official notice. The Federal Aviation Administration would conduct a full audit of the airline's passenger service system. Some flights were temporarily suspended. Pilots were chattering, employees were tired, customers were demanding refunds. On social media, the phrase "fleet grounded" began to appear, accompanied by Naomi's question as a symbol. Mark called Naomi. His voice was a little worried. "You know what happened? They're grounding Aero Vista flights." Naomi was quiet for a few seconds, then said softly, "I don't want anyone to lose their jobs, but sometimes, to fix a system, it has to stop first." Mark understood what she meant. "Do you know, you've just changed the whole industry." Naomi laughed. "I didn't do anything big. I just asked a question." That quote was later printed on thousands of posters, quoted in hundreds of articles, and became an inspirational quote in many forms about social justice. But at that moment, Naomi only felt strangely peaceful. That night, as she was getting ready for bed, her phone rang again. It was a text message from Evelyn Marsh. "I've been suspended," the flight attendant wrote, "but I'm not angry. I just want to say thank you. Thanks to you, I can see myself in the mirror more clearly. I believed I was just following the rules, but I was actually hiding my fear. Thank you for giving me the chance to change." Naomi read the message for a long time. She typed back, "We're all learning. Evelyn, don't be afraid of any lesson." She put down the phone and looked out at the night sky. Somewhere, hundreds of planes were sitting on the runway because of her one question. Naomi felt neither pride nor regret. She only knew that sometimes. Silence is the most dangerous thing, and tonight the world began to speak the truth again. The third morning after the incident, the Boston sky was gray. Naomi Ellison returned to the Neurobridge Health System's office after a business trip. When she entered the building, people stopped to say hello. Some smiled, some just looked silently. There was something strange in the office atmosphere, as if everyone wanted to say something to her, but no one dared to start. Naomi understood. They were proud, but also worried about her. She was not an internet star. She was their leader. She sat down and turned on her computer. Her inbox was filled with hundreds of emails, all with similar subject lines. Thank you, inspiration from Naomi, interview request, but the most prominent was an email bearing the Aerovista Airlines logo, with a short subject line, invitation to meet in person, discuss solutions. Naomi read the line over and over again. There was no apology, just an invitation. She leaned back in her chair, fiddling with her pen. Outside the window, the clouds drifted low, condensing into a hazy band. Two thoughts intertwined in her mind. One whispered, "Go see them, explain, and settle things." The other, colder, said, "No, this isn't just a personal matter. It belongs to all the people who have been treated the way you have." The phone rang. It was Eleanor Briggs, Aerovista's Director of Communications, directly. Her voice was husky and cautious. "Hello, Ms. Ellison. This is Eleanor from Aerovista. I'm very sorry for what happened. Our company would like to have a private meeting, just between us, to discuss the best way to handle this crisis." Naomi was silent for a few seconds, then asked, "Best for who?" Eleanor paused. "I believe it was for both sides. We understand how hurtful this was, and we want to apologize in a delicate way that doesn't make things worse." Naomi sighed. "I don't think going public will make things worse, but okay, I'll see you. I want to hear what Aerovista has to say to the world." The meeting was arranged at the firm's headquarters in Dallas. When Naomi entered the luxurious conference room, the atmosphere was as tense as a string. The white light on the glass table reflected each face. Eleanor Briggs stood up and extended her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, even under these circumstances." Naomi shook his hand lightly. "Me too. Actually, I still hope this is a conversation about ethics, not about reputation." Eleanor invited her to sit down, then began her presentation. "We realize that what happened was unexpected. Aerovista has served millions of passengers, and we never intended to discriminate. Your story has caused the public to misunderstand." Naomi interrupted, "Misunderstanding, Ms. Briggs. In that video, I asked a very clear question. No one edited it. No one made it up. Do you think the public misunderstood, or is your company misunderstand itself?" The room fell silent. A company advisor chimed in. "We just want to find a way to stabilize the situation. Perhaps we issue a joint statement, you accept the apology, and we fund an equality fund you proposed?" Naomi frowned. "So, my silence in exchange for a grant? No one said anything?" Eleanor sighed. "No, that's not it. We just want to turn the crisis into a positive opportunity." Naomi leaned back in her chair, her eyes straight. Positive opportunities only come when people dare to face the truth, not when they try to cover it with money. You want me to cooperate. I have one condition. I want to speak publicly at your press conference. No script, no editing." Eleanor stepped back slightly, her eyes worried. "Miss Ellison, That would be difficult to control. You know the media. Naomi smiled. That's why it makes sense. The air in the room froze. A second, 2 seconds, then Eleanor nodded. Okay, if that's what you need. But I want you to know, this company is facing the biggest crisis in its history. Naomi replied, I know, and sometimes a crisis is the only chance an organization has to find its soul. After the meeting, Naomi went outside into the hot, dry Texas wind. She stood under a tree, looking up at the sunny sky. Her mother's words echoed in her head. When you have a choice, choose something you're proud of when you look in the mirror. She knew she had made her choice. That night, Naomi sat alone in her hotel room. She wrote in her notebook tomorrow. I will speak not just for myself, but for all those who have never had their rightful place. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind was restless. In the middle of the night, her phone lit up. A message from Mark Hamilton. I heard you were going to speak. I'll be standing behind you if necessary. Naomi replied, Thanks, Mark. Maybe just one honest witness is enough. Outside, the lights of Dallas blazed. In their glow, Naomi knew that tomorrow she would face not just Arrow Vista, but the world. A world watching to see what she would say to a question that had grounded hundreds of flights. The next morning, Eleanor Briggs sent a confirmation email. The press conference will be at 10 a.m. in the Central Media Room. The national press will be present. We ask for your cooperation. Naomi read it and smiled slightly. There was no longer any fear or pressure in her mind. There was only one thought. If I don't say the right thing now, when will I? She stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her dark blue vest. Her eyes in the mirror were calm, strong, a little tired, but bright. She whispered, Mom, I won't scream today. I'll just ask one more question. As she stepped out of the room, the morning light fell on her face, warm and clear. For a moment, Naomi felt as if everything around her had stopped, save for the sound of her own heartbeat. A new day had begun, and it promised to be unlike any other in her life. The Arrow Vista press room was aglow with studio lights. Dozens of television cameras were trained on the stage, where the airline logo was set against a silver-blue background. Reporters jostled for seats, their voices murmuring like small waves. The air was thick with anticipation. In the front row, Eleanor Briggs sat, her face carefully made up but her eyes etched with worry. Beside her was Naomi Ellison, wearing a dark blue suit, her hair pulled back into a bun. She had no notes, no papers, just a small notebook in her hand. The Arrow Vista host stood up and began the program in a monotone voice. We apologize for the recent unfortunate events that have disappointed the community. Today, we would like to share our views and the way forward with Ms. Naomi Ellison. As soon as he finished speaking, hundreds of cameras turned to Naomi. She took a deep breath. In that moment, she could hear her heart clearly. Eleanor Briggs smiled wryly and gestured to Naomi. She stood up and walked up to the podium. The sound of her shoes clicking lightly on the floor echoed through the air. When Naomi took the microphone, the room fell silent. She looked straight ahead, her eyes calm and clear. Thank you for coming. I'm not here to attack anyone. I don't want to damage a company's reputation, but I believe there are moments when silence is complicity. Her voice was deep and steady, echoing evenly through the loudspeaker. 3 days ago, I asked a question, a seemingly simple question, yet seemingly too weighty to answer. "What do you think a first-class passenger looks like?" The audience held its breath. Naomi continued, "I'm not asking to offend anyone. I'm asking because I want to know. What are we teaching each other about human values? Why should looks, skin color, or demeanor determine how someone deserves to be treated?" She paused, looked around, and lowered her voice. "I used to believe that if I just worked hard and was kind, people would see me the way I was. But that day, I realized, sometimes no matter how successful you may be, people will still ask you, 'Are you sure you belong here?' The sound of cameras clicking continuously." Eleanor bowed her head, her hands tightening on the documents. Naomi turned slightly, looking at the Aerovista logo behind her. "I don't hate this airline. I don't hate the flight attendant that day either. I believe that most of us don't have any ill intentions. We just don't realize we're hurting someone unconsciously." A reporter stood up and asked, "Ms. Ellison, do you feel like you're turning a personal story into a political issue?" Naomi looked straight at him, her voice calm. "If fairness is political, then maybe I don't mind being seen as political." The audience laughed softly, but then quickly quieted down. Naomi put the notebook down on the table, opened a page, and read slowly. "A little girl in New Orleans wrote to me, 'Naomi, I watched your videos and cried. I was also told I wasn't cool enough to be there. Thank you for asking on my behalf.'" She closed the notebook, her eyes slightly red. "I can't ignore a child who feels like she has to ask permission to be respected." In the corner of the room, Mark Hamilton was filming the press conference. He looked at Naomi without blinking. Every word she said was like a stab to the audience's hearts. Eleanor glanced at him, then at Naomi, her eyes a mixture of admiration and helplessness. Naomi concluded her speech in a low, slow, clear voice. "I'm not asking Aerovista to apologize to me. I'm asking them to look at themselves, to look at the processes, the rules that led an employee to believe that doubt is safer than respect. And I hope that when their next flight takes off, everyone will feel a little relieved to know that no one was left behind." The room was silent for a few seconds. Then there was a sporadic applause, which grew louder. Eleanor Briggs bowed her head, her eyes wet. She stepped forward and took Naomi's hand. "Thank you, Ms. Ellison," she said softly enough so the microphone wouldn't pick it up. "You just did what we couldn't." Naomi returned the smile. After the press conference, the media exploded. News channels replayed excerpts of Naomi's speech. One reporter commented, "She didn't need to scream. She just told the truth in a voice so calm that no one could refute her." Millions of people shared the clip on social media, along with a new hashtag, the question continues. One person wrote, "She's not just asking about a chair. She's asking about a world that's so used to judging people." Another commented, "I watched it 5 times. Every time I want to stand up and applaud." That evening, Naomi returned to the hotel, the room bathed in warm yellow light. She sat down on a chair, took off her shoes, and put her notebook on the table. The phone rang. It was her mother. "Mrs." Ellison's voice echoed from across the ocean. "I saw you on TV. You did the right thing. But are you tired?" Naomi smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. "Yes, Mom, but the kind of tired that makes me feel like I'm still living the right life, Mrs." Ellison was silent for a few seconds, then said, "You know, I used to ask the same question, but no one listened." Naomi replied, "They do now, Mom." After the call, she went out onto the balcony. Dallas glowed below, the streets glowing like veins in the night. Naomi leaned her hand on the railing and whispered, "If one question can make people stop, then maybe it's time to ask more." Downstairs, Mark Hamilton was sitting with a group of reporters. One asked him, "What do you think makes her question so powerful?" Mark chuckled, because she didn't ask to win. She asked to make people look again. She asked with courage, not anger. On the TV in the cafe, Naomi's image was still playing. The news ended with a line across the screen, a question that made the whole sky listen. That night, Naomi sat down and wrote in her notebook, "Justice does not come from fame, but from the moment someone dares to ask the questions others are afraid to ask." Then she closed the notebook, turned off the light, and let the moonlight wash over her face. A new chapter in her story had just begun, but now she was no longer alone. 3 weeks after the press conference, the skies over Dallas were as blue as if they had never seen a storm. But inside Aero Vista Airlines, a quiet earthquake was underway. The airline began a massive restructuring program, starting with the suspension of more than 20 domestic flights to retrain its staff. The morning news called it the journey to start again. And, of course, Naomi Ellison's name was mentioned again and again as the source of the change. Naomi is no longer in Dallas. She is back in Boston, where the Neurobridge office is still operating normally after the chaotic media days. Since the press conference, she has refused all interview requests, no TV appearances, no speaking engagements. When colleagues ask why, she just smiles and says, "I've said enough. Now it's time for others to speak." But every morning, she receives hundreds of emails from all over, stories of people who were once doubted, once judged, but now feel seen. She reads each line, not rushing to respond, marking only the letters that make her heart heavy. One afternoon, as Naomi was getting ready to leave the office, the phone rang. The screen showed Eleanor Briggs. Eleanor's voice was softer than before, without the sharp edge of a communications director in crisis management. "Ms. Ellison, I want to say thank you. What you said that day helped us see something we've been avoiding," Naomi replied softly. "Thank you for looking." Eleanor paused for a moment, then said, "We're building a new program, a training program on cultural respect and unconscious bias. We'd like to invite you as an honorary advisor." Naomi laughed, her voice echoing softly in the quiet space. "Consulting for the firm has made me suspicious," Eleanor said. "That's why we need you." Naomi didn't answer right away. She looked out the window, watching the fading afternoon sky, the sunlight melting off the rooftops. Part of her wanted to get away from it all, to go back to her neuroscience research, which she loved more than media or politics. But another part of her knew that if she didn't come back, the changes might only be temporary. Finally, she said, "I'll think about it. I don't want to be honorary advisor just to take pictures and give speeches. If I join, I want to start from the bottom." Eleanor said quickly, "You have something I need to hear. Give us a chance." A week later, Naomi flew to Dallas again, this time with a different mindset. When she walked into Aero Vista headquarters, no one looked at her with curiosity or wariness. Instead, there was quiet respect. Those who had attended the press conference that day stood up as she passed. Eleanor greeted her with a genuine handshake. "Welcome back, Miss Ellison." Naomi smiled. "I hope I don't get asked for a first-class ticket this time." They both laughed, small but sincere. The first training session took place in a small hall, No reporters, no cameras, just over 30 employees, mostly flight attendants and ground staff. Naomi stood before them, not lecturing, not using slides, just telling a story. I'm not here to teach anyone. I just want to review one thing with you. Respect doesn't start with process. It starts with people. She talked about her mother, about how she was underestimated because of the color of her skin. She talked about that flight, about how she felt when suspicious eyes fell on her. The room was silent. A male employee, his face tanned, whispered, "I've worked here for 10 years. I never thought a question would make me think so much." Naomi looked at him and nodded. "Me too, until the day it came out of my mouth." In the following weeks, the program expanded to all Aero Vista locations. Naomi didn't show up at all of them, but her team helped create content, teaching managers how to listen. The media called it the Ellison effect. It was no longer a storm, but a steady, widespread, slow-burning current. One morning, Naomi received a text message from Evelyn Marsh. The flight attendant had returned to work after a temporary suspension. The message read, "I met a black passenger today." I greeted her with a smile and said, "Thank you for flying with us." She smiled back, and I knew. That was how I started over. Naomi read the message, tears streaming down her face. She replied, "Thank you for continuing." In a brief interview afterward, Eleanor Briggs was asked, "Was Aero Vista changed out of fear or faith?" She replied, "First it was fear. Now it is faith." Because one woman asked the right question. That evening, Naomi sat alone in her office, the desk lamplight reflecting off a blank page of her notebook. She wrote, "Every system can change, but only if someone dares to ask why it exists." Then she closed the notebook, turned off the light, and stepped out onto the balcony. Boston at night was quiet, the distant twinkling lights like stars drifting across the ground. The phone rang. It was Mark Hamilton. "I was watching the news. You're getting people talking about respect again." Naomi laughed. "I don't get people talking. I just ask, and they find the answers." Mark said, "You know, I think the world needs more questions like that." Naomi replied, "Maybe, but to ask, one must first dare to look." The call ended. Naomi sat quietly, thinking about the journey. She was no longer the woman who was denied a first-class seat, but the woman who made an entire airline stop and look back at herself. But what warmed her heart the most was not the fame, but the small messages, the stories of change from ordinary people. Last night, Naomi was invited to Aero Vista's anniversary event. When she walked up to the stage to receive her honorary plaque, the audience stood up and applauded. Eleanor Briggs walked up and handed her a plaque that read, "In honor of Dr. Naomi Ellison, whose question helped us find our humanity." Naomi looked at the plaque, then looked down at the auditorium. Her eyes stopped at the last row, where Evelyn Marsh was sitting. They both smiled. No words were needed. When the stage lights went out, Naomi stood still for a moment. She knew her question had served its first purpose, but deep down, she also knew that there were still many flights out there that had yet to land, and she would continue to ask, gently, but enough to stir. October is here, and Boston is starting to get chilly. The maple leaves are changing color, and the streets along the Charles River are glowing in the autumn sun. Naomi Ellison steps off the trolley, a woolen scarf wrapped lightly around her neck. She looks at the familiar iron gate that reads Cambridge University, where she began her education more than 20 years ago. It feels both familiar and strange. Every brick, every tree holds memories. Back then, she was the first black student in her medical school class, sitting in the back row for fear of being stared at. Today, she returns as the honorary speaker for ethics and equality in modern leadership. Hundreds of students were sitting in the auditorium. The atmosphere was a little excited. Many people whispered her name. When Naomi stepped onto the podium, there was a long applause. She raised her hand and smiled. "Thank you. Today, I didn't come to teach. I just wanted to tell a story that started from a chair." The audience laughed lightly, the atmosphere lightened. Naomi briefly recounted the incident on the flight, but not in a heroic way. She spoke in a steady voice, as if recounting an old memory. "I never thought that question would spread so far. I just knew. In that moment, I couldn't keep quiet anymore. And sometimes, it's just a small moment like that that changes things more than we think." A student stood up and asked, "Ms. Ellison, what is the hardest thing about facing injustice?" Naomi looked at her with gentle eyes. "It is not letting anger become a weapon. When we are angry, we want to win, but fairness is not about winning. It is about making others realize that we are all the same." The entire auditorium was silent, except for the sound of the wind blowing through the windows. She talked about her student life, the days she had to work part-time at the library to buy books, the presentations where lecturers did not look her in the eye. "I used to think I had to work twice as hard to be recognized. But then I understood. Working hard is not to prove my worth, but to keep myself from losing faith in myself." A male student asked, after your video went viral, "Did you ever feel scared, being watched by so many people?" Naomi nodded. "Yes, I was afraid of being misunderstood. I was afraid that I would accidentally become a symbol that I didn't want to be. But then I realized people are only scared when they think they have something to lose. But I wasn't. I had the most precious thing, which was the truth." At the back of the auditorium, Mark Hamilton sat quietly listening. He had arrived unannounced when Naomi got to the part about courage. He felt a lump in his throat. He remembered her standing in the middle of the first-class cabin, her voice echoing in the silence. Now, it was the same voice, only in a space filled with light and hope. "When I ask that question, a lot of people think I'm being defensive," Naomi continued. "But really, I just want to start a conversation. Because change doesn't start with anger. It starts with conversation. And to have a conversation, you have to be willing to listen." She paused, looking down at the front row, where a group of students of color sat. "You're going to have a lot of doors closed. You're going to have people tell you you're not good enough. But don't knock harder. Build your own door." The applause was long and loud. A white student stood up, his voice filled with emotion. "Ms. Ellison, I watched that video with my father, who is a veteran. He said, 'You don't have to shout to make the world hear.' He said, 'That's real power.'" Naomi smiled. "Tell your father. I just learned that from my mother. She always said, 'You don't have to be loud to be heard. You just have to say the right thing.'" The talk lasted longer than expected. When it ended, dozens of students approached her asking for photos and autographs. Naomi signed her name in her notebook, on the covers of her notebooks, on small notes. One young girl said, "Naomi, thank you for making me believe that I can change something, even if it's just a question." Naomi put her hand on her shoulder. You can, if you just mean it." As the auditorium gradually emptied, Naomi walked out onto the school grounds. Yellow leaves were falling everywhere, and the cold wind gently touched her cheeks. Mark approached, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I guess you still drink black coffee without sugar." Naomi smiled and accepted the coffee. "Thanks. I remember." The two sat on the old stone bench where Naomi used to study when she was a student. Mark said, "You know, the video your press conference has become a teaching content in many leadership courses. You have created what people call a cultural phenomenon." Naomi looked at her cup of coffee, tilting her head slightly. "I don't want to be a phenomenon. I just want the world to slow down a bit, so that people can see each other more clearly." Mark nodded, then asked Will, "You continue this journey." Naomi looked into the distance, where the late afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees. "I don't know if it's a journey or what, but I know there are still many questions that have not been asked, and I will still ask them, even if not on stage or in front of the camera. Sometimes just asking in your heart is enough." The afternoon sun fell on their shoulders. The distant church bells rang out, mingling with the rustling of leaves. Naomi said softly, her voice almost a whisper, "Perhaps the most beautiful thing about asking the right question is that it makes others ask themselves." Mark looked at her and smiled, "And the world is better for it." As she left the school, Naomi turned back to look at the gate once more. She was no longer the scared student she once was. She'd come a long way to return, not to prove anything, but to give back the trust she had lost. She walked slowly, her mother's voice echoing in her head. "You don't need to sit in first class to be respected. Just sit in the right place." After her speech in Cambridge, Naomi Ellison thought things would calm down, but she was wrong. Her speech was recorded by students and shared online, and in just 2 days, the video had nearly 10 million views. Her simple words were quoted everywhere. "Don't knock on a closed door, build your own." The media called her the voice of calm courage. She didn't say another word, but the world seemed to be talking about her. One morning, while Naomi was making coffee in her office, her assistant walked in with a government-stamped envelope. "Someone from the Department of Transportation sent this for you." Naomi opened it, and inside was an official invitation from the Federal Commission on Equal Travel Opportunity. They wanted her to join as a special advisor on a national project to improve passenger service across all airlines. Naomi looked at the bold text, "We need voices that can change how the world travels." She was silent for a long time, then said softly, "The world is flying, and maybe it's time for it to learn how to land more gently." As the news spread, her name was mentioned again in the press. Major newspapers ran headlines: "Naomi Ellison, the woman once denied first-class seats, is now being asked to change the rules of the airline industry." Some praised her, others were skeptical. One TV commentator said, "Her question not only stopped one airline, but now could force the entire system to learn how to fly properly." Naomi accepted, "But on one clear condition, I will participate if we talk about the issues honestly, without evasion or embellishment." On her first day in Washington, D.C., the committee members greeted her with a mixture of curiosity and respect. In the large, white-lit conference room, the chair said, "Ms. Ellison, we want to hear from you first." Naomi stood up, her eyes bright, her voice calm. "I am not a policy expert. I am someone who has sat in the wrong seat because others thought I was not qualified. Our problem is not a lack of process, but a lack of trust. If we do not train people to see each other with respect, all policy is meaningless. The room fell silent. One delegate nodded, another took notes. From that moment on, Naomi was no longer just a guest. She became the centerpiece of the reform agenda. In the evening, Naomi left the Capitol building. The weather in Washington was chilly, and the wind blew across the Potomac River. Mark Hamilton was waiting for her at a nearby cafe. When she entered, he stood up, smiling gently. "I know you won't be able to sit still," Naomi replied, her eyes mischievous. "I don't know. It seems like the universe keeps dragging me into this." Mark said, "It's not the universe. It's because you make people believe they can change. You've become proof that kindness can be as strong as power." Naomi smiled, but her eyes darkened. "I'm just afraid that people will forget the core." This was never my story, but the story of all those who have been treated as if they didn't deserve to sit in the right place. Mark looked at her for a long time, then whispered, "Sometimes one person speaking the truth can make thousands of others find their voice, and that's what you did." Naomi nodded slightly, not saying anything more. She looked out the window, the lights reflecting on the river, the cars passing by like moving stars. The next day, Naomi met with the committee's engineers and experts. They were discussing a new customer experience rating system. "We could tie fairness metrics to feedback data," said a young engineer, "but I'm not sure that's practical enough." Naomi walked to the board, picked up a pen, and wrote 3 large letters, "Human First System." "There's no data to measure respect," she said. "But if every employee is trained to start from the human point of view, not the process, that's what real change is." The room was silent, then gradually erupted into applause. A few weeks later, the program was officially announced. The current president called Naomi a breath of humanity into American aviation. The ceremony was solemn, but Naomi did not speak. When asked why by a reporter, she simply said, "I have said enough with the question. Now it is time for action to answer." Meanwhile, in Dallas, Eleanor Briggs watched the show on TV. She sat in the Aero Vista office and saw Naomi standing with the senior executives, her smile as gentle as the first time they met. Eleanor whispered to her assistant, "She made me believe that sometimes mistakes can be opportunities to learn to be a better person." At the same time, Evelyn Marsh was on duty on a flight to New York. As passengers boarded, she smiled and greeted each one. An older white woman said, "Thank you for your smile." "I feel better now," Evelyn replied. "That's what Naomi taught me, that a greeting can be the beginning of respect." The woman smiled, and Evelyn felt her heart lighten. That evening, Naomi returned to the hotel. She opened the window and looked out at the bright city. The phone rang. It was her mother. She said warmly, "I saw you on TV. You've been away for a long time. Naomi." She replied, "No, Mom, I'm just coming back with everyone else on the same flight." She smiled, then kept a steady hand on the wheel. Naomi smiled, tears falling softly. "I'll try. Mom." She put down her phone and opened her notebook. On the first page, she wrote a sentence: "Justice is not where we arrive, but how we fly together." She closed the notebook, the light falling on her face, half bright and half dark. Outside, the planes with glittering lights were preparing to take off. Naomi watched, her heart strangely at peace. Winter arrived slowly that year. The skies were a silvery gray, but at major airports, a different mood was taking shape. Aerovista flights and many other airlines began using a new system, the Human First System, developed by the Federal Aviation Administration and inspired by Naomi Ellison's question. Training sessions called the Ellison Initiative continued, not just for flight attendants but also for executives. People learned to look at the process through a more humanistic lens, to recognize and remove unconscious bias. The morning news was positive. One question changed the American airline industry. One editor said, but when Naomi watched, she was not happy. She feared the praise would distract people from the real reason. She did not want her question to become a symbol for display. One evening, while in her Washington office, Naomi met with her committee group. A senior executive said we could trademark the Ellison Protocol, which would have a powerful effect. Naomi looked at him, her eyes calm but firm. If we turn respect into a brand, we lose its meaning. I do not want my name to become a promotional tool. The room fell silent. After a few seconds, a young female executive said, Ms. Ellison is right. If this becomes a product, it loses its soul. Naomi smiled, gently but firmly. Let it be a value, not a campaign. After the meeting, Naomi left the building as snow began to fall. White flakes glistened in the streetlights, landing lightly on her coat. She paused, looking up at the sky. Everything was so quiet she could hear her heart beating. She remembered her early days as a resident, working in a public hospital in Chicago. Every day she faced skeptical looks from patients, simply because they didn't believe a black doctor could be as good as anyone else. She had come a long way to get here, but deep down, Naomi knew there were many others starting the same journey, and they needed to see hope. A week later, Naomi was invited to the grand opening of Aerovista's new training center in Denver. When she walked in, everyone stood up and applauded. A plaque hung on the wall that read, "Respect takes flight." Naomi looked at the hundreds of employees standing before her, many of them faces she had seen before. Evelyn Marsh was there, in her new uniform. As Naomi approached, Evelyn stepped forward and took her hand. I want to thank you, not just for the second chance, but for making us understand that respect begins with you. Naomi smiled. I didn't teach you that. I just asked, and you answered. After the ceremony, Naomi met Eleanor Briggs in the VIP lounge. Eleanor looked healthier, her eyes brighter than during the crisis. Miss Ellison, I have to say, I never thought I would be so proud of a crisis. Naomi laughed because it is no longer a crisis, but an opportunity. Eleanor nodded. I want you to know things are starting to change, not only in the company, but in each person. People talk to each other differently. They listen more, I think. That is the most magical thing a question can create. That night, Naomi didn't return home immediately, but stayed in Denver for another night. She went to the airport and sat in the waiting area watching the planes take off. A small black girl sat next to her, holding a model airplane. She looked at her and asked, Do you work here? Naomi smiled, Not really, but I do my part to make these flights better. She smiled, her eyes shining. I want to be a pilot when I grow up, but my friends told me I can't because I'm a girl. Naomi leaned down and gently touched her shoulder. You can do anything if you believe you're good enough, and you don't need anyone's permission to dream. She smiled brightly. I'll remember what you said. Naomi watched as the little girl ran towards her mother, overwhelmed with emotion. She realized that perhaps the greatest impact was not in policies or projects, but in small moments like these, when trust was given and received. When Naomi returned to Boston, she found a small package with no sender name. Inside was a letter and an Aero Vista first-class ticket. The handwritten note read this time, "First class is yours, but we know you'll choose to sit where you're needed most." Naomi laughed, then fell silent for a long time. She folded the letter and set it on the table, her eyes filled with tears. That night, Naomi went out onto the balcony. The city below was still bright, the lights like stars. Mark Hamilton video-called, his face visible in the dim light. "I heard they named the new training center after you." Naomi laughed. "I don't want that, but if it reminds them why they do it, then fine." Mark said, "You know, there's so many voices in this world that want to be heard, but only a few dare to ask the questions that make people listen. You are one of them." Naomi replied softly, "Maybe I'm just the one who asked the first question. The rest, the world will answer." The night wind blew, carrying the sound of cars fading away. Naomi closed her eyes and took a deep breath. In her mind, an image of her first flight appeared, the moment she was denied first class, the doubtful eyes, the question that came out of her as if by instinct. Now, when she thought back, she no longer felt angry, only grateful, because that moment had opened up a journey she had never dared to dream of. She went back inside and took out her notebook. On a blank page, she wrote, "Sometimes the things that hurt the most are the things that get you where you belong. Not because they feel good, but because they feel true." Then she put down her pen and smiled. Outside, the sky was still wide open, and she knew that her question, the one that once grounded an airline, had now become a reminder for a world learning to fly together. The following spring, America was awash with cherry blossoms. In Washington, D.C., billboards along Pennsylvania Avenue bore a new slogan, "Human First, Respect Takes Flight." The small print underneath read, "Inspired by Dr. Naomi Ellison." Naomi looked at the billboard through the car window on her way to an international conference. She was still humbled and a little surprised. She never thought that a simple question on a flight could spread so far. But, in fact, the spirit she sowed had taken root everywhere. That year's conference brought together representatives from more than 20 countries. They came to learn about the training model on respect and social awareness developed from the Human First System program. In the luxurious conference room, Naomi stepped onto the stage to applause. She was as simple as ever, wearing only a white blouse and dark pants. Her voice was steady and warm. "I'm not here to talk about success. I'm here to remind that every success begins with the courage to ask why. No great change can happen without the smallest question." She recounted her journey, but not to glorify herself, but to emphasize that true strength comes from everyone stepping forward, not just one person standing up. After her speech, a group of reporters surrounded her. One from England asked, "Ms. Ellison, what do you think made the world respond so strongly to your story?" Naomi replied softly, "Maybe because deep down, everyone has felt wronged. And when someone stands up and speaks for that feeling, everyone sees themselves in it." Another reporter asked, "Do you worry about your message being commercialized?" Naomi smiled. "I would only worry if people stop believing that respect is a personal choice. If they turn it into a brand for living better, I think that's not a bad thing." That evening, Naomi dined with Mark Hamilton at a small restaurant along the Potomac River. He told her that many schools had incorporated her speech into their civics curriculum. In Texas, a group of high school students had formed a club called the Ask Why Project, where students were encouraged to question the injustices around them. Naomi smiled softly, her eyes warm. It's funny. It all started with a question, and now they're teaching kids to ask questions. Maybe there's hope for the world. Mark replied, No, Naomi, there's hope for the world because of people like you. A week later, Naomi accepted an invitation to Ghana to attend a forum on global equality. The 11-hour flight took her back to Africa, where her ancestors originated. When the plane landed, she felt an indescribable feeling both returning and starting over. At the Accra airport, hundreds of people greeted her with flowers and songs. A young girl approached her and said in a trembling voice, Naomi, I watch your videos every night. We have flights here where people are not treated fairly, but because of you, we are starting to believe that everyone deserves to be heard. Naomi hugged the girl, her voice breaking. Thank you. Never stop believing in your worth. The Ghana Forum took place in a large auditorium attended by many international leaders and activists. Naomi spoke briefly, I do not bring solutions. I only bring a question. And I believe that when every country dares to ask the right question, we will be closer to true justice. When she walked down, the whole hall stood up and applauded. A South African female minister approached and said, You do not speak like a politician. You speak like someone who has been through trauma. Naomi smiled, because I have been through it, and I know that trauma can be a guiding light. When Naomi returned to the United States, her email inbox was flooded with speaking invitations, thank you notes, and stories from all over. But one email stopped her in her tracks. It was from a girl named Alana Brooks, a freshman at Yale University. She wrote, Naomi, I wasn't denied a first-class seat, but I was denied a scholarship because the examiner thought I didn't have the right demeanor. I cried, but then I remembered your story. I stood up and asked, What is the right demeanor? Now I'm back. Thank you for teaching me to ask. Naomi read the last line over and over again, her heart aching. One afternoon, Naomi met Eleanor Briggs again at a conference in New York. Eleanor had now left Aero Vista to start her own consulting firm on corporate culture. When they met, they hugged. Eleanor said, I always thought, if you hadn't asked that day, we would probably still be a good airline, but I never knew we could become a good airline. Naomi replied softly, Sometimes being good is just seeing each other. That night, Naomi sat alone in her hotel room, the yellow light illuminating the mirror before her. She looked at herself, clearly seeing the traces of time, a few gray hairs, a few wrinkles around her eyes, but there was something in her gaze that she had never seen before, peace. She opened her notebook and wrote, When someone else continues to speak for me, that is when I know I have done my part. The next day, Naomi accepted an invitation to speak at the United Nations on the topic of human dignity in the age of globalization. As she stepped onto the podium, reporters from all over raised their cameras. Naomi didn't say much. She simply recounted the story of the first-class seat. Then paused for a long moment, looked straight into the hall, and said, I don't want the world to remember me as the woman who was denied a first-class seat. I want the world to remember that one day an entire airline stopped because of a question. The entire audience stood up, and applause broke out. When the stage lights went out, Naomi left the hall and walked onto the steps of the United Nations. The night sky was full of stars, their lights reflecting off the tall glass buildings. She raised her head and looked, a thought ringing in her heart. Perhaps every question is a seed. If I dare to plant it, sooner or later, the world will bloom. One autumn morning, sunlight streamed through the large windows of her Boston office. Naomi Ellison sat at her desk, a steaming cup of coffee in her hand. On her computer screen, the headline read The Human First Foundation, Launch Announcement. It was a project she had been working on for nearly a year. No longer just a movement in the aviation industry, she now wanted to turn the human first spirit into a global program of education and awareness, where children were taught to see others with empathy before learning how to argue or succeed. She believed that if the next generation learned to ask the right questions, the world would not need many people like her standing up to correct mistakes. When Mark Hamilton walked in, she was still focused on revising her speech for the launch. He set the file down on the table, his eyes shining with pride. Naomi, you know, in just 6 months, more than a dozen countries have signed up to partner with the foundation. They want to bring your program into their schools. Naomi smiled, her voice soft. It's not my program, Mark. It's for everyone who has ever felt silenced. I just opened the first door. The fund's launch took place in New York, in a grand building overlooking the Hudson River. Hundreds of people attended, from educators and leaders to ordinary people who had been inspired by her story. On the big screen were the words, "Every question can change a life." When Naomi took the stage, she didn't talk about fame, didn't mention the moment on the plane. She talked about the night before the press conference, when she almost gave up out of fear. I remember thinking, if I don't speak up, will someone else speak up for me? And I realized that silence is an option, just not mine. She paused, her voice softer. I don't want people to remember me as an icon. I want them to remember that sometimes change begins when you dare to ask a simple question why the ceremony ended with long applause and flashbulbs. But the moment that touched Naomi most was not when she signed the foundation papers, but when a 10-year-old boy walked up to the stage and handed her a handwritten letter. Naomi, I want to grow up asking questions that make people feel understood. She bent down and hugged the boy. In that moment, she felt clearly that true legacy lies not in speeches or honorary degrees, but in the little souls who begin to believe they have the right to speak. After the event, Naomi and Mark walked along the riverbank. The wind was cool, the water sparkling, reflecting the lights from the Brooklyn Bridge in the distance. Mark was silent for a moment, then said, You did something no one thought possible. A small question has now become a global movement, Naomi replied, her voice quiet. I don't want to call it a movement. I want it to become a habit of respect, of listening. Mark looked at her, nodded slightly, and you know, what I admire most is that you never let anger lead the way. Naomi smiled, her eyes distant. Anger can create an echo, but only kindness leaves an echo. A few months later, Naomi received an invitation from a school in Louisiana, the same one where she had attended high school. They wanted her to come back and talk to the students about her journey. As her car pulled up in front of her old school, memories flooded back. The green iron gate, the small schoolyard with rows of oak trees were still there. Only the children were different. When she walked into the hall, hundreds of eyes looked up. A curly-haired girl sitting in the front row asked, "Naomi, do you ever think people will believe you?" Naomi smiled, stepping closer to the girl. "No, I don't think so, but I believe in myself, and when you believe in yourself enough to ask, others will listen." After the talk, the school principal gave her a small gift, a wooden plaque engraved with the words, "From silence to strength." Naomi held the plaque, tears falling from her eyes. She touched the words lightly, feeling her own journey encapsulated in those 5 words. When Naomi returned to Boston, she received good news. Human First had just received a multi-million-dollar grant from an international organization to expand into Asia and South America. The first projects would be in Brazil and Japan. In a meeting with her team, Naomi said, "Money is needed, but it is important that we keep the original spirit, teaching people to ask, not to resist, but to understand." The room was silent. Then a young employee said, "You know, Ms. Ellison, the way you talk makes people want to be better people." Naomi just smiled. "I don't teach anyone to be good. I just remind everyone that everyone was good at one time. You just have to remember that night." Naomi sat on the balcony, looking down at the sleeping city. The phone rang. It was her mother. Her voice was as warm as ever I heard you started a fund. "I'm so proud of you." Naomi smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. "I am just continuing what you taught me. Respect is not something you need to be given, but something you need to keep for others." She was silent for a moment and then said softly, "You know, if your father were still alive, he would be so proud. He always believed you were born to do great things, but he never expected that great thing to come from a question." Naomi smiled through her tears. "Sometimes the greatest things start from the smallest things. Mom," before going to bed, she opened the old notebook where she had recorded every step of her journey from the very first day. On the last page, she wrote, "A question asked with courage never dies. It lives on in those who follow, in every look that looks at another person with respect." Outside the window, the night wind blew, carrying with it the distant whistle of a plane taking off. Naomi watched, a small smile on her lips. She knew her legacy lay not in the sky, but in the hearts of those who had learned to fly together, not with power, but with kindness. Boston, a summer morning. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, bathing the floor of the Human First Foundation office in a warm yellow. Naomi Ellison sat in a conference room, surrounded by her young team. Her last meeting before the long break had begun with a simple question. How many people have we helped learn to ask the right questions? The room laughed, then quieted to think. One young employee replied, "I can't count, ma'am, but I think it's a lot, because every time someone asks something respectfully, they're speaking in your voice." Naomi smiled. It was the answer she'd been waiting for. She was retiring after more than a decade of tireless dedication. But for Naomi, retiring wasn't about stopping. She wanted to write a book, not to tell her story, but to record the stories of others people who were inspired, who dared to ask, who changed. The title she chose was simple, because someone asked. That day, Mark Hamilton stopped by the office. He placed a small box in front of her. A temporary farewell gift before you start your next chapter. Naomi opened the box. Inside was a miniature model of a silver-colored metal airplane. The words engraved on the base read, "It all started with a question." She looked at it for a long time, her eyes filled with emotion. "Mark, you know, sometimes I think if I had just kept quiet that day, maybe my life would have been much easier." Mark replied, his voice warm, happy. "But this world will lose something great. Your gentleness will never compare to the change you have brought." Naomi laughed, her smile a little tired but still bright. She began her journey writing the book in a small house on the river outside Boston. Every morning, she made coffee, opened her laptop, and wrote. There was no pressure, no expectations, just little stories of courage and dignity. There was the story of the little girl in Ghana who hugged her and cried, the Texas high school student who founded the Ask Why project, and the former flight attendant named Evelyn Marsh, who now works as a culture trainer for new airlines. Each character, each question, each little journey woven into the larger picture of change. One late afternoon, Naomi sat by the window, watching the birds fly over the river. The phone rang. It was Eleanor Briggs. They hadn't seen each other for a long time. Eleanor said, her voice weaker but still warm. "Naomi, I just read the newspaper. Your foundation has been recognized by UNESCO as one of the most influential humanitarian initiatives in the world." "Congratulations," Naomi replied softly. "It's not me, Eleanor. It's all the people who dare to ask the question I asked." Eleanor chuckled. "I used to think your question was just a protest, but now I understand. It's an invitation for the world to look back at itself." Naomi was silent for a moment, and then said, "Eleanor, perhaps the most beautiful thing in this journey is not changing others, but changing myself. I have learned to love this world even though it is not perfect." In August, Naomi was invited to the 10th anniversary celebration of the Human First System in Washington, D.C. Thousands of people attended, from politicians to educators to ordinary citizens. When she walked on stage, the audience rose to their feet. The MC introduced her as the woman who made the world learn to ask itself. Naomi looked out at the audience, her voice slow and gentle. "I used to believe that power lay in the ability to answer. But after all, I realized real power lies in daring to ask. A question can interrupt, but it can also heal. It makes us stop, think, and see each other more clearly. If the world learned to ask more, maybe we would have to shout less." The room fell silent. No one spoke for a few seconds. Then the applause was loud, long and genuine. Mark, in the crowd, looked up at the stage, his eyes full of pride. He knew this might be Naomi's last public appearance as a host, but he also knew her legacy would never fade. After the ceremony, Naomi walked out into the hallway, the afternoon fading, the late afternoon sun stretched across the marble floor. A young girl approached, her eyes sparkling. "Naomi, I am Alana Brooks's daughter. My mother told me that it was your story that kept her from giving up her dream of studying. I am now a first-year law student. I just wanted to say thank you." Naomi looked at the girl, her eyes gentle. "You don't need to thank me. Just remember to ask when something doesn't feel right. And when you ask with kindness." The girl smiled, nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. That night, Naomi returned to her hotel and sat by the window, looking out at the city lights. She opened an old notebook, the first page of which was yellowed, where she had written, "What do you think a first-class passenger looks like underneath that line?" She wrote a new sentence. "Perhaps first class isn't about the seat, but how we treat each other." A gentle breeze blew, The notebook trembled slightly. Naomi closed it, placing her hand on the cover. She closed her eyes and smiled. Outside, a plane took off, the sound of the engine echoing in the distance, deep and warm like the sky's farewell. The next morning, the news broke. Dr. Naomi Ellison had died in her sleep, peacefully and serenely. She had gone as she had lived, gently, deeply, and with lasting effects. The world was shocked, but not saddened. People did not call it death, but a final flight. A week later, millions watched the memorial online. She left not an empire, but a question, the president said, and that question will resonate forever. In Boston, the Human First Foundation renamed its main lobby the Ellison Hall of Empathy. A plaque on the marble wall bears her last words, "Justice is not where we go. It is how we fly." Mark Hamilton sat quietly in the corner. He opened the small box Naomi had kept inside were a notebook, a pen, and an old first-class ticket. He read each line, his voice trembling. "You asked, and the world answered. Out there, planes still take off, carrying millions of people, millions of stories, and somewhere in the sky, Naomi Ellison's question still quietly echoes, reminding the world that sometimes just one question is enough to make humanity more humane. Naomi Ellison's story is not just about a first-class seat, but about how people treat each other. When she was treated unfairly, she did not choose to get angry. She did not choose to scream. She chose to ask a simple question, but powerful enough to make the whole world stop and think. What does a first-class passenger look like to you? The story's most profound message is this: justice doesn't start with rules. It starts with respect. Real change doesn't come from someone shouting louder. It comes from calmly speaking up for what's right. In life, there will be times when we'll be judged, doubted, and hurt. But if we keep our faith, keep our kindness, we'll be the ones to change the world around us, even if it's just with a question, a small action, or a non-judgmental smile. For older audiences, Naomi's story is a gentle reminder that kindness never goes out of style. No matter the age, what makes a person great is not power, but how we make others feel seen and respected. Thank you for taking the time to follow today's story. If Naomi Ellison's story touches your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can spread more stories about compassion and the power of kindness. Let's continue the journey to find trust between people.